Peter is actually the very first name that came to my mind when I was contemplating doing podcasts. And let me just give all of you who don't know Peter a little bit of an idea of him, of his work. Peter is someone who, to me, has really kind of unparalleled knowledge and passion for the origins of Western culture. It's interesting because he's an incredible scholar of that time period, but he's also a first-class mystic. And those are, at least in the modern day, those are a kind of unusual combination. I think originally, thousands of years ago, they were not an unusual combination. They usually came together, actually, but now they've kind of split apart. Peter's also been an author of, I think, Peter, five books, the latest of which is Catafalque, Carl Jung, and the End of Humanity, I think put out in 2018. Anyway, that's a brief, short introduction, but thank you for being with me, Peter. I really appreciate you coming in and having a conversation with me.
Well, I appreciate you, Adia. I appreciate you, and it's always lovely to be with you. It's always lovely to speak with you. It's interesting to see the connections between us, what they really are. I mean, you've mentioned, as it were, things that you're not, I suppose. You wouldn't identify as a scholar and so on. But it's interesting to see what the connections are between us. You said something a couple of years ago about our caring. I remember that you felt a connection with me because we both care so much. And I feel that's true, but there must be a lot of people out there who really, really care. And I think somewhere I feel that the connection between us is that we recognize that we are willing to do anything for the sake of the truth.
Yeah.
That's certainly what I recognize in you, and it's like a brother there. You will do anything for the sake of the truth, and that creates this solidarity with you that I value and treasure so much.
Yeah. Well, thank you very, very much. And I think you really articulated that connection. I remember, just on a personal note, I remember the first time that I met you, and you were kind enough to invite me over. I think it was to a lunch. And I knocked on the door, and you opened the door. And yeah, I always find it an interesting thing whenever I meet somebody, especially somebody that I have a sort of connection with without even knowing exactly what it is or exactly why, because we really didn't know each other much at all. And when we met, after we met, and I was talking to my wife, Mukti, and I said, this is one of the most odd encounters I've ever had. And she said, why is that? And I said, well, it was so interesting. When he opened the door, we exchanged pleasantries. He reached out and shook my hand. And I said, I had this very visceral bodily feeling that I was surprised that there was an actual sort of solid hand at the end of his arm, because I said I felt like I was just going to put my hand through something more like air or water. And that was something to do with the presence of you. And I think that was the beginning of, at least for me, of I always find encounters like that just so fascinating, because they're an entry point into a mystery that goes some far, far beyond what we would probably conventionally call something personal. But it's like a doorway into something.
Yes. But now that you're mentioning this, before we move on and away from the personal, before we met, I think that my book Reality meant something to you, and I remember finding that odd. You, a Zen teacher, I would expect that when you were traveling around or at home, you'd be carrying the sayings of the early Zen patriarchs and studying the Diamond Sutra. But I was interested in what, and I suppose I still am, what it was in this book, Reality. That was the name of the book that I wrote, God knows how many years ago. Yeah. What it was that drew you to it.
Well, that's an interesting question, because It's a very fascinating book. I've told you the surface reasons that I liked it, the exquisite quality of writing, which says nothing to as far as what it has to say, and to me it was almost like participating in some sort of ancient ritual or magic spell to read it. And I had to read it about the third time I started to really understand in a more visceral way, not just an intellectual way, what was going on with that book. The connection point for me, Peter, was, and this came years after I started to teach. And I had this, I guess I could say it was something that was shown to me. I had kind of an unusual background for a Zen teacher. My teacher, she taught out of her home, and she had met and studied with some of the very best of the early wave of Zen teachers that came here from Japan. Because a lot of the early ones, they were looking for really sincere people. That's why they fanned out and were looking around. And anyway, she had the good fortune to study with him. But by the time I met her, she had raised 5 kids. She had sort of took off her Zen robes, and she was teaching in her living room in this very unadorned, seemingly quite ordinary way. Anyway, fast forward years later, I was with her 14 years before she asked me to teach. She's a little over 100 years old now. And it was shown to me one day sort of what this lineage was. Now, in Zen, of course, they make a big deal about lineage and who your teacher and your teacher's teacher and all of that, and for good reason. And yet, what I was shown that there was this almost like other lineage that I was a part of and that she was a part of. And it was a lineage that had very, very, very ancient roots. In fact, so far back that I don't know where they came from. They were definitely before Buddhism. It was this line of transmission that had very little anchors in the, like tangible anchors in the world. Most traditions will have their temples and their writ material and their rituals and all these things that I think, at least in part, are ways of anchoring the transcendent or the realization of transcendent into the world of time and space in a way. Yeah. And yet this lineage had very, 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 very little of that. It was almost like air. It was like a lineage of air or water. And yet it was something that I felt or was shown was extraordinarily ancient and old. And now getting to the book Reality, what I felt in that book, which took me about the third reading to really start to get clear on, was here was apart from what you were seeming to write about, there was something very, very ancient here. There was something that had to do with deep, deep spiritual roots that go back who knows how far. And it was more of a transmission. It was more of a feeling. And that was like the brotherhood. Like, okay, there's something about what's going on in this book and being talked about, and more than being talked about, something that's being sort of transmitted in almost a verbally ritualistic way, at least to me. Something about it felt extremely resonant for me. And so that began the connection, just as obscure as this sort of lineage that I intuited. I don't know, I just saw something of it reflected in the book Reality that you'd written. And then when I met you, of course, it was reflected even more strongly. So that was sort of the ground or the root of my sense of connection with you and your work. And you're right, it's very different from Zen, and Zen's not particularly mystical in sort of a traditional sense of the word. And so there's a lot of, I guess, divergence at one level of the work that you present, and at least the Zen side of my background. And yet there's something else. And it's that something else that has always felt very, very resonant with you. I guess that's the best way to put it.
Well, I'd like to say something in reply to that. This airless, this formless, this shapeless tradition. I call it the tradition behind other traditions. It's the tradition that weaves in and out of other traditions. And it weaves from east to west and west to east. This is one of the reasons why it is, for example, that Carl Jung, who I think is a great love of ours, probably of both of us, and that's no accident, why he saw his work as being a Zen for the West. I find that intriguing. It is problematic because people don't like a tradition behind other traditions. They can feel insecure or threatened or wobbly or say that it's hype or it's imaginary or fictional. And I mean, I know in my case, I'm not just a scholar, as you said. I mean, the scholarship for me is a cloak that I just put on or take off at will, but there's something behind the scholarship, always has been for me. And what it is behind, people sometimes say, well, how can you be teaching primordial meditation, as I used to? And how can you be talking about an ancient lineage where you don't have a predecessor? And I just have to laugh because one of the figures who traced out one of the branches, of the many branches of this hidden tradition, lived in the 12th century, and he was put to death in his 30s for what he said. It was dangerous, still is dangerous to talk about these things. And he talked about the leaven. I love this word. He talked about the eternal leaven. And the eternal leaven, what is the point about leaven? It is alive. It rises. It is what makes bread rise. It is a physical essence of life. And that can be transmitted in the strangest of ways. It doesn't need necessarily the physical, constant generation-to-generation transmission.
Yeah, I love that word too. It makes it sort of visceral, at least for me. And I think I've only talked about this once, and it was years ago when it first came to me. So it's not a subject that I dive in often. But you're not the kind of guy that I'm going to just dive into common threads of conversation. And I think it's interesting that we get a chance here together to kind of, at least in some way, clarify what seems to be a thread of connection, because we've never talked about this before.
No.
And yet here we are, we open up the conversation. I didn't plan on speaking about it either. I'm always intrigued by the plans we make and then the things that really happen.
I know. Well, that's the joy of being with friends as well. That's the joy of being with a real friend. You come from one tradition, I come from another, and I love one of the sayings from the old Zen tradition, as far as I remember, and that is the imagery of mirrors. However clean we keep the mirror, sometimes the rust comes on, and friends are there to help to rub the rust off our mirror. And maybe we can be cleaning each other's mirrors in this way, through coming from different traditions, and yet at the same time, as we both admitted somewhere, these different traditions, they straddle East and West, and they're not really different at all.